Hi, I'm Andrew Grossman, and this is In the Garden. You know, September is one of my favorite times of year, and the reason is that it's the highlight of the dahlia season. Right now, I'm standing next to a dinner plate dahlia. They're called dinner plate dahlias because the flowers are quite large. And as we look down the row here, you'll see that there are quite a number of different colors and different varieties. Dahlias grow from a tuber, which looks a lot like a small potato, and you plant it in the spring after danger of frost. Dahlias are not cold hardy, which means they will be killed by frost. But the tubers themselves are very inexpensive as plants go. Now, I get most of my dahlia tubers by ordering them from mail order catalogs, such as Swan Island Dahlias, which offers a huge selection of dahlias. They come in a tremendous range of colors, with practically every color combination you can think of except for true blue. The way that you grow dahlias is you want to pick a very sunny spot and loosen up your soil and amend it with some well-rotted cow manure or compost. And they also really benefit from an addition of bone meal. But other than that, once you plant them, you really just sit back and let them grow. Now these, because they're so large, have to be very heavily staked. And I have them tied up on these wooden teepees that I actually make by cutting down sumac trees that grow in my field behind me. But you can also just buy bamboo stakes from your local box store, garden center, or hardware store. Once I have my teepees in place, I plant the dahlia tubers in the ground, not very deep, usually about 6 inches deep, and then I just wait for them to start growing. As they grow, I continue to take twine and tie them into the stakes. And this is what keeps them supported. Now, they are susceptible to breakage when we have heavy wind or heavy rain. Here's one that broke in the rainstorm that we had a couple nights ago. They also benefit from deadheading, so when I'm not cutting them to bring inside and use for arrangements or give to friends, I make a point of coming out regularly and taking the dead flowers off, because that encourages the new flowers to keep coming out. One thing you'll notice when you look at this beautiful pink variety is that the first flowers, the ones lower down, tend to be bigger, and then the secondary flowers are smaller. But they all make great cutting flowers no matter what the size. And I grow a tremendous number of dahlias in my garden, and we're going to take a look at some more in a minute. But first, let's take a look at these. If I step over this way, you can see this is why they're called dinner plates. Look at the size of this flower. And what's interesting about this variety is that the striping and the speckling in the petals is variable. So on the exact same plant, this is one plant, we have this flower which is almost a solid pink, but then we have these flowers which are striped. So that makes it more interesting. And again, these, 3 of these flowers makes a whole vase. Down here further, we have another variety. And this one again, this one's starting to go by a little bit, so I'll cut this one off. But this is actually one of my favorites. Look at the beautiful butterscotch color of this. And these look amazing in flower arrangements. The other thing that's really great about dahlias is that if you're willing to take the time, a little bit of extra time and energy to dig them up in the fall, you can store them over the winter. They need to be stored in a cool, dry place. I store them in my house in a crawl space under my office that doesn't have a basement. So they stay cool, but they don't freeze. When I bought this plant, this tuber, I got in the mail one tuber about the size of like a new potato. When I dig this plant up in the fall, I will have a giant, almost the same as with a potato, I will have a giant handful of tubers all connected together. Next spring, I can take those tubers and divide them up. So for the investment of one tuber, which I believe this plant cost me, the tuber cost $8, I could get 20 plants out of it next year. And in fact, this plant is from the original tuber, and I'll show you on the other side of my house some more dinner plate dahlias which also came from one tuber. So the thing to remember about dahlias is that if you want to save them, you wait until frost has killed the stems. So you'll come out after a hard frost and I'll see that this entire plant is blackened. Oh, here's one that broke over a little bit in the rain last night, so I'm just going to cut that off and probably use it in a flower arrangement later today. So as I was saying, in the fall, after hard frost, this whole plant will be blackened, and in fact it will almost turn to mush. At that point, I cut all the stems off of it and I dig up the whole thing of tubers. People have different thoughts on what is the best way to winter them over. I find just putting them in a paper bag, like a grocery paper bag, and storing them in a cool, dry place until the spring works fine. Before we head over to look at some more dahlias, I wanted to point out this shrub. People always ask me, well, what is going to be blooming in my garden late in the season in September? And this is a great choice. This is called Caryopteris, or blue mist shrub. It's also one of the few truly blue flowering shrubs for your garden. Now, this is a dwarf or more compact variety. There are a number of different varieties of Caryopteris that range in size from this, which is about 2.5 to 3 feet, to 4, almost to 5 feet. Caryopteris is very easy to grow if you give it the right conditions. It is actually a little bit particular about soil. It does not like moisture, particularly over the winter. So it does very well in this spot because it's hot and sunny and the soil tends to dry out a little bit more in the winter. If you try to grow Caryopteris in a location that has very wet soil during the winter months, it will often rot and die. But if you have a sort of hot, dry, sunny spot, this is a great choice. And in particular because of these beautiful blue flowers now in September when not a lot of other things are blooming. A few years ago, I ordered 3 dahlia tubers of this beautiful yellow variety. This one sort of gets a sort of blushy center, which gives the flower a little bit more depth. Originally, I had planted these dahlias in the garden behind me. And one year while I was doing that, I sort of must have accidentally thrown a spare tuber behind me and forgot about it. It wasn't even planted, but it grew up by itself. But because it wasn't planted in the ground, it grew horizontally, which I thought made a really terrific effect. So what I've done now is, now let me just say that all these yellow dahlias, this whole row of them, and it wraps this entire garden, came from the original 3 individual tubers that I bought. So you can really see that you can get a huge number of dahlias from a single tuber if you're willing to winter them over and then divide them in the spring. Now what I do with these is I plant them actually quite far back in the garden. They're planted way back over in here. Initially, they start to grow up vertically, and when they get to be about 3 feet tall, I very gently lay them down. What that does is it forces them to make a lot more branches all along the stem, and it makes them look like a dwarf dahlia, like a very short dahlia, when in fact, if these were growing vertically, they'd be probably 4 feet tall. But because I gently bend them over, and if you look closely, you can see where the stems are actually lying right across the ground here. I love the effect that they create when they grow horizontally like this, because you get such a huge mass of flowers right low to the ground. Now, dahlias do also come in dwarf varieties, very short varieties in fact. You can buy dahlias that get no higher than a foot, but they won't give you this lush effect that growing these tall dahlias horizontally will give you. Behind me are these pink dahlias. Now this variety is a type called a spider dahlia, and that's because the flowers, here I'll cut one and bring it over. The flowers are very spiky. The individual petals sort of make a spike, almost like a spider chrysanthemum. And so these are called spider dahlias, whereas these, which have a rounder petal and sort of a flatter look, are called water lily types. There are a number of different classifications of dahlia blooms, and there are single dahlias, there are double dahlias, there are spiders, there are water lily types, there are some that are very odd looking. And again, if you go online and Google dahlias and look at the different suppliers, you'll see such a huge number of different varieties of dahlias. There certainly will be one that would fit into practically any situation you might have in your garden. Let's take a look at some more dahlias. Now I'm standing in front of some other dinner plate dahlias, and I honestly have to say I've grown this variety for probably 3 years and I've never seen it get this tall. It's been a banner year for dahlias, partly because it's been so hot and also because we've had periods of dryness followed by periods of heavy rain. Dahlias like very deep watering, but they don't like tons of water all the time. Dahlias benefit from hot, full sun and then a really deep watering, as opposed to, say, the way you would water your lawn, which is, watering it for 10 minutes every day. Dahlias would prefer to be watered for a half an hour to even an hour. These are watered with a drip hose. I have a drip hose running you can see a little bit of it right here. I have a drip hose running through this bed in between all the dahlias, and I usually turn it on for about an hour twice a week if we don't have rain. We've had so much heavy rain recently that I won't need to water for quite a while. But these are, as you can see, it's like a Jack and the Beanstalk plant. They're so tall. And again, you'll notice if you look up that some of the flowers are bright red, some of them are yellow and orange, some of them are very orange, and this is all on the same plant. One of the reasons that there are so many different dahlia varieties is because of this variability in the flowers. Even within a single plant, you can get a huge amount of variety. So if we walk down this row, you'll see some that are similar to the other ones we looked at. This is another variety that I really love because of this orange and yellow, and how sort of curly and fluffy it is. Now they don't all do that. This one is very much that way. This one is a little bit more contained in its look. But either way, they're so beautiful. Now these dahlias, which have a smaller flower, are actually the closest to true blue that dahlias come, and this actually is obviously not really that blue, it's more of a purple. I had actually originally bought them based on a photograph that showed them as being blue, and I fell for the joke, so to speak. But this is the closest to blue that dahlias come. Now even with the smaller dahlias, staking is really important, and if you can see, there are stakes throughout. This is probably, I think I planted 6 different dahlia tubers in this group, and when I planted them, I put the stakes in right away. It's much easier if you have your stakes in place and then can just tie the dahlias up as they grow versus trying to stake them once they're already tall. That was a lesson I sort of learned the hard way. But now I always make a point of putting my stakes in the ground, then planting my dahlia tubers right at the base of each stake, and then as they grow, you can see the twine here. I tie them to either the individual stakes, or sometimes I'll do a loop all the way around. Now one of the things that happens with the twine is that over time it stretches. This was tight before, and over time with the water and the wind it stretches. So what I'll often do is come in and just tighten it up by making a little loop in it like that. And that effectively shortens it to hold them a little bit tighter. And the tying up of them is very important, particularly as they get heavy with bloom, because one of the things that has kept these looking so good through the torrential rains we've been having is that they're well staked and well tied up. Since we were talking about blue flowers and how these dahlias are not really truly blue, I thought I'd show you one of my favorite late season blue flowers. This is Salvia uliginosa, and it has one of the only really true sky blue flowers that you can find. This is a tender perennial, which means that in a warmer climate it would grow as a perennial, but in our climate it dies in the winter, and generally I replant it every year. It takes probably a few months for it to get to this size, but once it does, it keeps throwing these flowers right until frost, and I love how they're airy and such a beautiful sky blue. Now this is a truly shorter version of a dahlia. This is its full height, so this is probably only about 18 inches high. And it's not, I didn't lie it down, this is its height. And this one has these beautiful pink flowers that have a little bit of white with highlights on the petal tips. This dahlia I actually bought from a garden center as a potted plant. And you can buy dahlias from your box store, you can buy them from garden centers as already growing plants. One of the things about that versus ordering them as tubers is that they're much more expensive, and the choices that you have are much more limited. But if you want an instant effect, you can certainly go to a garden center and buy dahlias already growing in pots and just plant them directly into your garden. If you do that, you can still dig up the tubers in the fall and winter them over. These I wintered over, and I had originally, I think, had 3. This is probably 4 tubers, and there's probably another 15 planted in different parts of the garden. So if you're looking for a more instant effect and don't want to grow dahlias from tubers, you can find them as already growing plants at your garden center. Now this is a sedum called Brilliant. It's a sport of sort of an original variety called Autumn Joy, and this is a perennial. This is a very easy to grow perennial that gives you great color late in the season, September into October. The flower heads will actually turn a rusty color once they're done blooming, and they're also great for cutting. But people often ask me, you know, what's blooming in your garden in September? And this is one of the plants that's blooming in my garden in September. There are a number of different varieties of sedums that bloom this time of year. There's Brilliant, there's Autumn Joy. Some of you may recall that in a previous episode I planted a different variety of sedum in this garden in another area. This one has been in place now for 2 years. This is its second season. This is 3 plants. So you can see that it makes quite a nice full shape in the garden and really is showy for this time of year. Now most sedums like full sun and will tolerate somewhat of a drier soil. They don't like shade and they don't like too much moisture, but overall it's really not a finicky plant, and it's probably one of the easiest plants you can grow in your garden, and they do look terrific massed. I've used them in clients' gardens where I've planted as many as 15 or 20 plants together in one large group, and that really makes a terrific effect this time of year. They're also relatively unbothered by pests, although I have had some trouble with snails with them earlier in the year, but they seem to shrug that off and bounce right back. Some of you may remember that in an earlier episode I showed you how to divide a stand of overgrown or tired irises. And if you remember, this was a big stand of irises that was overgrown. They had gotten tired, a lot of the leaves were brown, and I divided them up and replanted them, and you can see how well they've done in just a matter of probably six weeks. They've rooted in beautifully, the new foliage looks great, the fans are nice and healthy, and these are a reblooming iris, which means that they will often bloom again in the fall. So I'm hoping that even though I did just transplant them, they will throw some flowers for me this fall. Some of you may also remember that in a previous episode I showed you how to rejuvenate a stand of daylilies that had already finished blooming. I've been going to different people's homes a lot recently, and I have to say that most people's daylily clumps look terrible this time of year. But these, which I pulled all the dead leaves off of about 6 weeks ago to a month ago, and took all the dead leaves off and exposed the new growth. Now look at the new growth. Even though they're not planting, this is still a pretty addition to my garden right now because the foliage is so green and healthy and lush looking, and it looks terrific next to the grass that's just starting to seed behind me. So I just wanted to give you a little update on that and to show you that it really does work. Once your daylilies have finished blooming and they look really ratty, go ahead and do what I showed you. Cut off the dead flower stems, pull off all the old leaves, and they will rejuvenate with this beautiful new growth, which will carry me right until the end of the season, making this garden look much fresher than it would have otherwise. Now this is another dahlia variety. This one is actually called David Howard, and look, there's a bumblebee just having some fun in the flower there. This one I grow not only for the beautiful orange flowers, which I love, but also for the red foliage. A number of dahlia varieties have colored foliage, mostly into the red tones. It's a little redder earlier in the season, but that adds to the overall effect. And since this garden has a lot of colored foliage and has a number of yellow foliage plants, red foliage plants, this is a great addition. And again, you can see where I put the stakes in. So I put the stakes in when I planted these tubers. Now there were 5 or 6 tubers planted here. Further down in the garden there are another 5 or 6, and they all came from 3 tubers that I bought a number of years ago. So it's been a great investment, and I probably could have gotten even more tubers out of them this spring if I had needed more. As I'm standing here, I'm noticing that these could use another little bit of a tie-in because they're getting a little bit tall, and even though they're very upright, I want to give them a little bit more support. So I have just a nice piece of green garden twine. Now earlier on in the season I tied them back to the individual stakes, but now I'm just going to loop it around this way and sort of use the plants to support each other. So I'm just going to bring this around the outside here. And I try not to tie things too tight. So this is just about perfect. And then I just make a little knot in it like that. As I mentioned before, the twine tends to stretch over time, so if it's a little bit tighter than I would want, I know that it's going to loosen up. But see, this gives this a little bit more support so it can't pull away, and it's holding the whole group up. So that ought to keep them nicely vertical for the rest of the season. A few minutes ago we looked at a variety of sedum called Brilliant. This is another sedum variety. It's called Matrona. And this one is grown partly for its foliage, which earlier in the season, now it's faded out, but earlier in the season has a very strong reddish cast. These flowers are actually a little bit too pale of a color for this garden, which is supposed to have very strong colors, but in another 3 weeks this is going to sort of all turn a russet color. You can see it darkening up a little bit over here where the flowers are actually going by. So once these flowers go by, the seed heads are going to be sort of a coppery russet color, which does work with the garden. And like other sedums, this likes full sun, it doesn't like too much moisture, and it's very, very easy to grow. This striking plant is Canna pretoria, also known as Canna Bengal tiger. It has this amazing striped foliage, which in itself is reason enough to grow it, but it's topped this time of year by striking yellowy orange flowers, which will continue until frost. This also is not hardy here. So this grows from a rhizome, which is like a root stock. And every fall, as with my dahlias, once we have frost and the stems are all browned, I cut the stems off, I dig up the rhizomes, and I store them in a cool, dry place in a paper bag for the winter. These, though, actually benefit from a good soaking before I plant them again in the spring. So what I do right before I'm going to plant them is I fill up a bucket with water and I throw the rhizomes into the water and I soak them for at least 24 hours, and then I plant them, and that makes them come up a little bit quicker. In a more tropical climate, you would see this growing outside year-round, and it would continue to make a larger and larger clump. But here, we have to dig them up in the winter. This is the last group of dahlias that I want to show you in my garden today. This one is called Bishop of Landolph. And you can see it's quite different from the other ones because the flowers are small and they're also single, meaning there's just a single row of petals. They're not great for cutting because they don't last a long time, but they do make a really nice, delicate show in the garden. And like the previous dahlias I showed you with the orange flowers, this also has a nice russety red color to the foliage, which adds to the interest even when they're not in bloom, which is one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of this dahlia. Now, one of the things I should mention is that, like most annuals, dahlias really benefit from having the dead flowers cut off. So I come through regularly. It takes sometimes a little while to get used to being able to recognize what the difference is between a bud. Here's a bud that hasn't opened yet. It's sort of flat. And here is a flower that's already gone by. So this is the seed head. So here I would just take that right off. This one has already gone by. It dropped all its petals. So I'll take that off. And I regularly go through with all my dahlias. And if I'm not cutting them to bring into the house, but I see a number of dead flowers on them, I regularly deadhead them. Now let's take a look at some other things growing in the blue and white garden. Right now I'm standing in front of a big stand of a blue flower that some of you might think is ageratum, which is a common annual plant that a lot of people buy in 6-packs or in little pots to plant in their garden for the summer. But this is actually a eupatorum, which is a perennial. This is Eupatorum colistinum, and it does have a very ageratum-like flower, which is a beautiful skyish blue, which again is a hard color to come by in the garden and doubly hard to come by in September, which is one of the reasons this is such a terrific plant. One of the things that you'll notice as we walk around this garden is how much of it I have. And the reason for that is this is also a terrific self-seeder. Now, self-seeders are plants that are perennial or annual, but that will flower and then create seed that will sort of spontaneously come up in the garden various places. This has been a banner year for this plant self-seeding, which means that last fall, when I didn't have nearly as much of it, the wind blew the seeds around and they landed in different parts of the garden and came up on their own. Now, I honestly think it's bordering on a bit too much at the moment, so next year I may do a little judicious weeding out of some of the seedlings, but it is such a terrific blue, and when I think about how much color it adds to the garden this time of year, I am a little bit hesitant to pull it out. But as with, all things, you can have too much of a good thing, so I will probably pull some of this out even this year, and next year I'll keep an eye on it a bit more. If you look above me, you'll see this amazing vine full, literally covered in white flowers. This is Clematis maxowitziana or Clematis paniculata. They keep changing the name for some reason, but it's commonly known as sweet autumn clematis. When I mention clematis, a lot of people think of the large flowered clematis that blooms in early June and into July, but this is a fall blooming clematis, and it's covered in masses of little white flowers that make a terrific show in the garden. This is a very easy vine to grow. It can take full sun, it can take part shade, and it's one of the few vines that blooms this time of year, which is why it's such a great asset to a lot of gardens. I have it growing over this arbor, but you can grow it up. Any kind of support will really do well, but because it's such a rampant grower, it does need a strong support. I've also seen it used to great effect growing over low stone walls or over a fence. If you have a split rail fence, it's a great choice for that. So if you're looking for something to bloom in your garden that's a climber late in the season, this is a great choice. It also has a very sweet fragrance, and that adds to its appeal. I mentioned plant self-seeding earlier, and here's another example. This is actually just a little white woodland aster. I don't even know technically what its Latin name is. I didn't plant it in the garden. It came up by itself. It probably blew in. The seeds probably came in on the wind from the field next door. But I love it because it flowers this time of year. It's the perfect color for my blue and white garden, and it's pretty indestructible. So I've just let it stay in certain places, and you'll notice as we walk around the garden, you'll see it blooming in different areas. And it really started me thinking a while ago. I wrote a blog post in my blog, A Year in the Garden, that was about how Mother Nature can really make it hard on gardeners with insect damage, with heavy rain, with too much dryness, with too much water. I had groundhogs eating my garden this year, and it really can get frustrating. But the flip side of that is that Mother Nature also just dusts my garden with beautiful asters that I didn't plant, with the blue eupatorum that self-seeds and comes up in a whole lot of different places. So it really is a trade-off. For as often as I feel frustrated because things aren't doing well or because the weather isn't cooperating, I feel grateful for things that are just gifts that come my way, that I don't have to buy and that don't really need much care, like these beautiful white woodland asters. This striking plant is Cimicifuga brunette. It's called brunette because the foliage has sort of a reddish cast to it, which is, even as is the case with most foliage plants, more striking earlier in the season. But the thing that's great about this plant is that it blooms late in the season. So here we are, it's early September in southern New England, and it's just starting to bloom. The other thing that's really terrific about this plant, and I wish that you could smell it, is the fragrance. This has the sweetest fragrance that perfumes the entire garden, particularly in the early evening. I love to come out and just take a walk and just breathe in this sweet fragrance. I grow a number of different Cimicifugas in this garden. This is the only one that has the reddish leaves, but they all have the same sort of spike of white flowers, hence its common name, snake plant, which I guess refers to the shape of the flower. This plant likes shade, so if you have a shady garden, this is a great choice for you. It doesn't really, in my garden, have any pest problems, and it comes back terrifically every year. So if you're looking for some late white blooms in your garden and you like fragrance, take a look at Cimicifuga. You can find it at most garden centers, particularly this time of year. Well, I hope you enjoyed looking at dahlias with me today, and I hope you'll consider planting some in your garden next year. Remember, they're very easy to order online, and there are literally hundreds of varieties, so you'll certainly be able to find one that suits your garden. Or you can buy them at box stores or even as growing plants at your garden center. Thanks again for tuning in, and I hope you'll join me next week here in the garden.